Hello everyone, my name is Ali Qureshi and today you're watching the lecture on IT and Information Security Risk Management. So the content of this whole presentation would be what is risk, why risk management is needed, what are the basic definitions to understand the whole process of risk management, and have an overview of the same. And we will close this presentation with a particular conclusion that what we learned from this whole discussion. So starting off, what is a risk? So ISO 27005, which is an information security risk management risk assessment standard, states that potential that a given threat will exploit vulnerabilities of an asset or group of assets and thereby cause harm to the organization. Now, from that we mean is that the probability that a particular threat will exploit a vulnerability and the impact resulted by that particular exploitation is risk. So we would be understanding it even further through this formula. This is a well-coded formula across books and various literature, that risk is equal to the impact of a threat exploiting the vulnerability multiplied by likelihood of a threat attempting to exploit the vulnerability. I'm sorry. So vulnerability is weakness and threat is a potential aspect which can exploit a vulnerability, hence resulting in impact out of it. So impact, as we just discussed above, is like the outcome of a particular threat exploiting a vulnerability. Now we will be having an example like right after this, but to cut it short, that when a threat exploits a vulnerability, the outcome of it is the impact of that particular risk. Likelihood, in simple terms, it is how often does a particular threat attempts to exploit a vulnerability. Now, a good example would be that if you go and ask your SOC analyst that how often SQL injection attack happens, so he's going to tell you, for instance, 10 times a day or 20 times a day or something else. This is the likelihood, that how much, what is the occurrence of a particular threat exploiting a vulnerability. Coming to an example, what is a risk? Let's have an example. Now, first of all, let's have, as we discussed earlier, what threat is. Let's have an example that information disclosure is a threat that is applicable on a particular asset. The vulnerability could be the lack of vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. Information disclosure threat can exploit this vulnerability if there is no VAPT, that is, vulnerability assessment and penetration testing exercise conducted on that particular asset. Information disclosure may happen. What could be the likelihood of it? So as I mentioned earlier, for instance, in order to calculate the likelihood of an SQL injection attack, one had to go to the SOC analyst. So similarly, based on industry's best practices or experience, or there are certain advisories, we determine the likelihood of a threat. Afterwards, we determine that what if this threat exploits this vulnerability, what could be the impact of it? So as we have decided here that likelihood is really high, and for instance you define high by saying that happens at least once a day, that we rate that as high. Similarly, we could rate something with medium, that happens once a week, that could be medium, for instance. In a similar manner, here we define impact and we calculate its rating based on defined definitions. For instance, here we have mentioned that financial impact greater than 10 million. That is more a quantitative risk assessment approach which we will be discussing further in the presentation. Or in qualitative terms, shall have significant impact. So the impact rating is high here. Now what will be the risk? As we discussed earlier, the formula of risk is impact multiplied by likelihood. Now, risk rating is equal to high multiplied by high. That is, in this particular example, we calculated likelihood of this threat exploiting the vulnerability is high, and the impact of the same is high as well. So, on multiplying both of them, the resultant would be high. Hence, it's a high risk which has a high likelihood of occurring, likelihood that it may happen, and the resultant outcome of the same would be high and bad for the organization. So why do we need risk management? Big organizations and corporates want to avoid unwanted loss or financial impact that could impact their overall revenue. Hence, they plan their risks, they manage it in a way so that unwanted financial hit could be mitigated. So in order to understand a risk assessment process, one should know some definitions, which I'm going to start right now. So first of all, in this presentation, we will be more focusing on an asset or process-based risk assessment in an IT department. So either it could be based on an asset, for instance, if there is a server, that is an asset. If there is a website, it's an asset. Similarly, you could perform the risk assessment based on processes. You have various processes in IT. For instance, you have a change management process. You define it. Similarly, you would have many other processes like identity and access management or incident management. So, asset inventory or process inventory is the list of assets or processes that IT department owns. Asset valuation. Every asset has a value. Either in monetary terms, a particular server could cost around, for instance, let us just have an example, 100 million. That is the monetary value of that asset. So when you are going to perform quantitative risk assessment, then you may have to calculate the value of the asset in monetary terms. However, in qualitative terms or semi-quantitative terms, things are a bit different, which we will be discussing further in this presentation. On that, usually the value of the asset is calculated based on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of it. For instance, if there is an asset, a server, which is exposed over the internet and a lot of customers are accessing that server to it with the facilities that a particular company is providing. So 100% you would want the confidentiality of that particular asset to be ensured, so as integrity, and you would want the availability of the server to be 100% so that whenever a customer wants to avail the services are available for him or her. What is a threat? As we discussed earlier, it is an aspect that could result an impact exploiting a vulnerability. So previously we discussed an example of information disclosure. Similarly, there could be other examples like service disruption. Vulnerability. One word meaning would be weakness. A weakness on a system or in a process is a vulnerability. Likelihood. As we mentioned earlier, a particular threat attempting to exploit a vulnerability. So how often that happens is the likelihood, or you may also call it occurrence. Impact. Again, as we discussed earlier, the outcome of a threat exploiting a vulnerability is an impact. For instance, it could be a regulatory penalty. For instance, a particular organization is not complying with a regulatory requirement. So one of the major risk would be regulatory penalties or restrictions, or this may also result in complete shutdown of business if the regulatory body decides to ban the organization. Some more definitions. Inherent risk. So risk which is naturally associated with the asset or process. Now, whenever you have a server up and running with an IT department, let us assume that it is not exposed over the internet. It has some inherent risk, for instance, hardware failure, or there could be malicious insider attempting to actually exploit a vulnerability which that particular asset holds. So inherent risk is more like a risk which is applicable on a particular asset and process when there is no control applied to it. Why are controls applied? To mitigate or treat the risk, which we will be discussing further in the presentation as well. Now, as I mentioned just now, control assessment and control value. Now, when you understand that there are certain risks that a particular asset or process is having on it, in order to mitigate those risks, you apply controls. Now, control can be a tool or a solution, or it could be a process that would allow a particular organization to either mitigate, transfer, or avoid the risk. Control assessment is an exercise of identifying control and measuring its effectiveness, that how effective that particular control is behaving against the identified risks. And based on the effectiveness, a control value is assigned, which is used in the risk assessment exercise. Residual risk. Now, once you have identified inherent risks, you have also identified the controls mitigating those risks, and you have evaluated those controls. That is, I just mentioned control value. Now you would be calculating residual risk. So residual risk in simple term is inherent risk minus the control value. So after applying a control on a particular risk, the risk left behind is called residual risk. Asset owner. Asset owner is the person from business side, a personnel who is the business user of a particular asset. And that particular asset owner owns the risks pertaining to the asset. Similarly, asset custodian is another term, which are the people usually from IT department who manage the asset. Now here in this discussion we are having assets of IT department. It could be a website, as I mentioned earlier, or a software. So asset custodian is usually managing those assets. One of the managing responsibility is applying controls to mitigate the risks. Risk owner, the person accountable for a risk. Usually the asset owner or personnel designated by the management is the risk owner of a particular asset. Now, as we have been discussing earlier, there are various types of risk assessment. Quantitative risk assessment. In this risk assessment, when we are calculating the risk, we also calculate that how much financial impact a company is having in monetary value and numbers. For instance, $100 million impact. We will have an example further. In qualitative risk assessment, we are actually calculating the same in a descriptive manner. The risk is not calculated on monetary value. However, we have it in qualitative descriptive terms: high financial impact, low financial impact, moderate financial impact. These are examples of qualitative terms. Semi-quantitative. It is combination of qualitative and quantitative. I hope you have understood the definitions. Let's further see an example to have a better understanding of the type of risk assessment. Now, first is quantitative risk assessment. Here you can see that the likelihood is on the left side and the impact, that is the consequence, is on the top side. Now, based on the calculation likelihood into consequence, there are certain values being calculated. For instance, if the likelihood value is 5 and the impact, that is the consequence, value is 3, we can see that it may result in 80,000 or sorry, $8,000 to $100,000 impact, which is overall a high risk value that the red color defines very high, the orange color defines high, yellow color defines medium, and the green color defines low. Similarly, here you can see in the qualitative risk assessment, we see that the definition of the risks are descriptive. They are sentences which are describing the risk, that what if a risk is high, what happens? In this example, the quantitative risk assessment, semi-quantitative risk assessment, you would be able to see that it is a little bit similar to the quantitative risk assessment in terms of number. From what I mean is that you can see that there are values: impact 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, likelihood 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and both of them get multiplied and an outcome is resulted. For instance, if we choose the value of impact 5 and likelihood value 5, so on the top corner we see high, 5 into 5 is 25, so the risk score of this particular value would be 25. So in qualitative terms the risk is high, but in quantitative terms the value is 25. So this is semi-quantitative risk assessment. Overview of a risk management process. Now, there are various international approaches and methodologies to perform risk assessment. There is NIST SP 850, ISO 27005, COBIT, Octave, FAIR. FAIR is an open source quantitative risk management risk assessment methodology. So let's have an overview of the whole process. Let's see how the flow goes. And before that, let us have an understanding of further more terms. That what is risk management? It is the asset or process valuation plus risk assessment plus risk treatment. So combine all these three things, you call it risk management. Hence, what is the difference of risk management? What is the difference between risk management and risk assessment? You can easily understand that risk management is the combination of asset process valuation, risk assessment, and risk treatment. What is risk assessment and treatment is something that we are going to discuss further. Asset and process valuation is what we have discussed previously. So let's have an overview of this whole process. First of all, in order to perform a risk assessment exercise, you need to identify and evaluate assets, or if you're doing a process-based risk assessment, you need to identify the processes. Afterwards, you will identify all the threats which are applicable on that particular asset or a process. Would be a good example we will be seeing further. Identification of vulnerabilities. Now, a particular threat can exploit various vulnerabilities. So you should be able to develop a mapping between threat and vulnerabilities. There will be a lot of threats which would be exploiting a lot of vulnerabilities, or maybe a single threat exploiting similar nature of vulnerabilities. This is an example. On the right bottom screen you can see that a threat information disclosure can exploit lack of VAPD, vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, that is. It could be exploited if there is a misconfiguration in an asset, or if the asset is not timely patched with security patches released by the vendor. So this is one of the object. There could be a lot of more vulnerabilities, a lot of more threats mapped with various vulnerabilities. After that, you perform impact assessment. You see that if that threat exploits the vulnerability, what impact can be resulted by it, as we have seen before. Afterwards, we determine the likelihood that how often this particular threat tries to exploit this vulnerability. Then we calculate the inherent risk value. How is that calculated? The value of impact multiplied by the value of likelihood multiplied by the value of asset. The result is inherent risk. Then we perform control assessment. We see that whether are there any controls applied to actually mitigate the identified risks. Then we calculate the residual risk based on the control values defined in the control assessment exercise based on the effectiveness of a control to mitigate that risk. And we are calculating that usually by dividing the value of inherent risk by the control value. That results in reasonable results, hence resulting better risk assessment activity. Afterwards, when we are able to see that what is the residual risk on a particular asset or process. Now, if the risk value is under acceptable levels for the organization, that yes, this risk is low and it has no significant or not an impact that would actually have a major impact on the stability of the organization or in any other terms. If the value is not in acceptable levels, then you initiate risk treatment. What is risk treatment? There are different types of risk treatment. Number one, you can mitigate the risk treatment, and you can mitigate the risk in the risk treatment. So for instance, as we discussed earlier, if information disclosure is a threat and the vulnerability is lack of vulnerability assessment and penetration testing exercise, so you can mitigate this risk by conducting a vulnerability assessment and penetration testing exercise. Transfer. Now, the best example of transfer a particular risk would be insurance. Now, for instance, when you buy a car, it's good that if you get it insured, because when it gets stolen or a major loss or accident happens, the insurance company take the financial hit to an extent which allows you to have least possible financial impact on you. Hence, you transfer the risk to an other party. The best example in terms of IT would be having cloud environments, cloud-based infrastructure, the security, the physical security, all such risks are borne by the cloud management party. Avoid. Trading a risk to avoid the risk would be similarly, for instance, if you want to launch an application. Now, if there is a possibility that your organization could run efficiently and effectively without an application, you could simply decommission it in order to avoid significantly impacting identified risks. And finally, accept. Now, once you are able to understand that this risk is something that you have to live with, you cannot mitigate it, you cannot do anything about it. So management decides that we will own this risk and we will accept it, that yes, this is a risk and we can't do anything about it. If this risk is coming up, or if a particular threat exploits the vulnerability resulting this particular risk, we will have an impact and we accept it. After having the risk treatment process, what you do is perform risk monitoring and reporting. Now, risk treatment process is not that simple. Now, once you actually decide that what action you're taking in risk treatment, either you are mitigating it, avoiding it, transferring it, or accepting it, you assign a risk owner, the person who is responsible to carrying out the decided and finalized risk treatment action. Risk treatment action, that is mitigating, transferring, avoiding, or accepting, is decided by the asset owner, who is usually the risk owner as well, or the management. Once the risk owner is decided, that person is responsible to actually carry out necessary action to fulfill the requirement of the risk treatment. Hence, reported back to the risk officer, who then performs the monitoring exercise, reassess the risks, and see that whether that if a risk was attempted to mitigate it, then what is the residual risk which exists till date, whether it is in acceptable levels or not. And then the same is reported to the management in order to have an oversight of the risk posture of the organization. Now, the process on the left side, that is from the identification and evaluation of asset or processes till the calculation of residual risk, this process is called risk assessment. And the process on the right, you can see, is risk treatment, which is a separate process, and risk monitoring and reporting is a separate process as well. So now you would be able to better understand what we discussed in the previous slide, that how risk management is a collection of various exercises, that is asset or process valuation, risk assessment, and risk treatment. Now, the conclusion of this presentation is that after having the whole understanding of what I just explained previously in the presentation, you should be able to understand that what is a risk, why do we need risk assessment, what is risk management, what is risk assessment, what is risk treatment, what is likelihood, impact, inherent, and risk value, what is the difference between threat, vulnerability, and risk, what is the difference between asset owner and asset custodian, what is the difference between risk management and risk assessment, what is the difference between qualitative, quantitative, and semi-quantitative risk management, and what is the flow of risk management process. These are usually the interview questions and questions that appear in exam regarding risk assessment or risk management. I hope that this presentation was useful for you. Please do not forget to subscribe and share the video and like it. And if you have any queries or something that you weren't able to understand, or if you have a question, please feel free to comment on the video and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much.